Hi, we are Stephanie, Logan, Zach, Spencer, Zach, and Tyler, and our presentation is on Nestle and their baby formula product. So, first, to go into the history of Nestle, Nestle was founded in 1867, and it was actually founded originally as a company that made baby formula and breast milk substitutes. Eventually, as we all know, Nestle expanded their product offering. They now offer everything from candy to ice cream to chips, but they still have baby formula as a large part of their business. So, criticism of Nestle first started in the 1970s when people started raising concerns about their marketing of their baby formula in developing countries. So, what is the problem? Nestle was getting accused of getting babies hooked on formula. So, essentially, was what they would do is in countries where mothers didn't understand the advantages of breast milk or what switching to formula could do, they would execute marketing tactics to try and get babies to try formula for a certain amount of time. And by the time the trial period ended, the baby wouldn't want breast milk any longer. They would only want formula. And in a lot of these third world countries, they have dirty water and they don't have the ability to sanitize bottles. So these babies were actually getting infections or getting illnesses from using formula. And sometimes it was even causing these babies' death. They were also using scare tactics, essentially saying that scaring mothers that they weren't generating enough breast milk and that they had to substitute with formula. And when those mothers would start substituting with formula, their babies wouldn't want breast milk any longer. They also would use misleading marketing, making mothers feel that their formula was as good for babies as breast milk when it is not. So this is a video that introduces the problem a little bit more.
Here in Vietnam, like in many other parts of Asia, baby milk powder is a booming business. Two Swiss companies are among the big brands, dairy producer Hochdorf and food giant Nestle. For Nestle, which is now in its 150th year, the product is still good business.
Still very, very strong in our portfolio. You see Cerelac, and actually it is something we're re-engaging even more, but because we see this importance of the first 1,000 days of a child. That is actually the base of his health during his whole life.
Nestle has a long tradition of making products for babies. Henri Nestle first developed milk-based baby food in 1866 and began marketing it. Soon, the product was exported abroad and the company became a multinational. In the 1970s, the successful product attracted a lot of criticism. The NGO War on Want went so far as to publish a leaflet saying Nestle's aggressive marketing strategy for its breast milk substitute was responsible for the death of children in third world countries. It said that when milk powder was used with contaminated water or dirty bottles, it often led to heavy diarrhea and even to the death of infants. The booklet was also translated into German by a group of Swiss activists, who Nestle filed charges against for defamation. Following a 2-year trial, the activists had to pay a fine for libel. The judge stated, though, that Nestle must fundamentally change its publicity methods. Ever since, the marketing of milk powder for newborns has been restricted by the World Health Organization. The products must have a label saying mother's milk and breastfeeding are still best for a baby's health in the first 6 months. One NGO lists breaches of this WHO marketing code in its biannual report. For co-author Patty Rundall, Nestle still isn't doing enough.
Nestle is still the biggest manufacturer of breast milk substitutes, and it is not at all abiding by the international recommendations from the World Health Assembly. And every time it doesn't abide by those minimum recommendations, it's putting babies' lives at risk.
So the next section of our presentation is who is harmed and who benefits from this practice. Obviously, Nestle benefits in the form of profits. That's why they're doing it. That's why they're selling products, is to make money, and that's how they benefit in what they're accused of doing, of these illegal marketing tactics. Others who benefit are the doctors and nurses, because in some cases, Nestle was incentivizing them to push this formula on mothers, telling them, as Stephanie explained, that the formula was better than their breast milk. Those harmed by this are the children, obviously the infants who are taking the formula and not getting their mother's milk. and then they're malnourished because of the other causes from having the formula, which is being made in potentially dirty bottles with dirty water and things like that. The mothers, obviously, and the families, just emotionally, financially, are harmed because of their infants when they get sick. That causes emotional trauma for the mothers and families. And it also puts an undue burden on the families to continue to purchase the formula once their sample runs out. Even in the United States, for a middle class family to purchase strictly formula for their baby can be quite a burden. So for these developing countries where their family budgets are extremely small, that can make the difference between some of the family eating or not. Doctors, nurses, and hospitals, while sometimes incentivized, could also be harmed because of a poor reputation. If the babies end up with problems, then they get a bad reputation among the people in that area, which also then harms the entire population in that area because they're not going to go to that hospital when they need to because they don't trust them. And this is all caused by the improper use of the formula, which is caused by the marketing tactics and the product labeling. The product labeling is not always in a language that the mothers and families understand or can read. The example that we read about was that the labeling was printed in English and the families were only familiar with either a local dialect or Portuguese potentially. So the rights exercised and ignored. Nestle obviously has a right to sell their product, and nations and international governing bodies have a right to restrict and regulate how products are marketed and sold. And Nestle was supposedly not following those laws and regulations. Also, mothers have a right to know what they're giving their child. As I talked about, the labeling was not appropriate because the mothers didn't know what was in the labeling. The doctors were not properly educated to educate the mothers in what they were giving their baby. And also the labels were not always honest about what was actually in the formula. And mothers and infants have the right to breastfeed and have the right to know and understand that that's the best option for them.
Okay, we do want to take a moment and talk about some of the causes that led to this controversy. And it really began back when canned food first was invented in the late 1800s. There was a huge demand in the canned food industry, and that extended into baby food, which in its own extended into infant food and formula, which eventually turned into mostly powder form. Since this product was new in the United States and in Europe, government was regulating who could be marketed to. And so it was against the law for these producers to market directly to consumers, to the mothers. Their marketing was restricted to medical professionals. Even though that marketing was being regulated, it was highly recommended by professionals up until about the 1970s. Up until that time, it was believed that baby formula was equal to or better than breast milk. Around that time, studies started to come out that showed that that was not the case. Now, that led to a drop in demand in the European and US markets. And in response to that drop in demand, Nestle began to increase their advertising in these developing countries where those type of marketing rules no longer existed or never existed to begin with, to be more specific. And so they started marketing directly to the mothers and started incentivizing hospitals to carry the product. These hospitals that were grossly underfunded, which essentially had no choice but to accept the incentives offered by Nestle. We do want to get into government requirements in this particular case, and a lot of that is tied into the causes leading up to this. And the government regulations, they did have a responsibility to protect the public, the information they were giving, and they did in fact regulate these marketing practices, but only in these first world countries. And therefore it was a failure of the government requirements in the third world countries to restrict who could be marketed to. Therefore, many of the mothers were showing up automatically requesting it because a lot of the advertising was directed towards wanting your baby to grow up like a Western child, fat and healthy. And therefore, the hospitals also under government requirements did not receive adequate funding, which put them in compromising situations where they almost had no choice but to accept the incentives and offer the samples to mothers. Also with distributive justice, which falls a lot along those lines, there was not equal access to information for the consumers in these countries. In the first world, in the United States and Europe primarily, access to this information and new studies around formula was readily available, whereas this information was not disseminated into these developing countries, and so mothers weren't able to make adequate decisions for their health. Also, with distributive justice, we go back to the funding of healthcare and hospitals and regulating what is and what is not allowed. And there was a fundamental failure to distribute those rights across borders, which is where Nestle took advantage.
So, for the ethical duties of contributed liberty and universal rules, we found that the universal rules, which can be summed up as never take action that you would not be willing to see others also be free to take, was very heavily impacted by Nestle's decision to market formula to being comparable to breast milk and also providing samples to mothers. So, the first one, providing samples to mothers, they were intentionally targeting lower education, less economically developed countries because they could get mothers that lacked the education to understand the repercussions of them switching to formula. And once the babies switched over to formula, often the sample size was large enough that the mother's natural milk production would slow down or stop so that they couldn't go back to using regular breast milk. By doing that, they took away the option and the choice for mothers to either feed their babies breast milk or feed them formula. And then the other way that the universal rules were not followed was when the WHO banned the production of baby milk products as being in any way comparable to breast milk. They still used a lot of marketing phrases, both in developing countries and developed countries, like the US, saying things like closest to breast milk, following the example of breast milk, inspired by human milk, and identical in structure to breast milk. And so these were just marketing terms that they argued did not actually promote baby milk products as being comparable to breast milk, but it was so close that it was very misleading, and mothers were not able to freely make the choice to feed their babies breast milk or formula based on the marketing terms. The next one, contributed liberty, which can simply be stated as never take action that will impact the rights of others for self-development and self-improvement. We found that this had a minor impact to others' self-development if taken to the extreme. When the choice to feed breast milk or formula is taken away, that self-development can be impacted if the child becomes malnourished from simply just drinking formula when they could be drinking breast milk and getting a lot more nutrients and vitamins and minerals from that breast milk.
Now we're going to cover long-term interest and personal virtue. The principle of long-term interest is clearly shown in the way Nestle handled their advertising in the baby market. It appears that Nestle isn't thinking about the long-term interest of their consumers, as they're constantly pushing dishonesty through their advertising efforts. Not only did these issues start back in the 1970s, they're still happening today, as mentioned previously. In terms of their overall brand and reputation, Nestle is putting it all on the line by trying to seize additional revenue from their captivating marketing tactics. Although this has proven to provide them with additional profit short term, they risk not only their brand in the baby market, but also in the overall brand, as any consumer is reminded of the controversy when Nestle is mentioned. In terms of personal virtues, honesty is key. A trait of honesty would be to treat everyone fairly and to avoid taking advantage of any particular person or group. Nestle showed their poor personal virtues by taking advantage of people from third world countries, by brainwashing them that their formula was better than breastfeeding. In the end, honesty is one of the most important attributes that people and consumers look for. If a consumer can't trust the company, then why would they buy their products?
Lastly, we'd like to determine how the principles of utilitarian benefits and religious injunctions were two ethical principles that we feel were grossly neglected. When it comes to religious injunction, we're looking at things that, like honesty and truthfulness, which have already been mentioned in our presentation earlier, that we feel that Nestle decided to neglect. But it should, as the principle states, go beyond that. We feel that there should be degrees of compassion and kindness. When we see in their marketing schemes to state that they're inspired by human milk, they're closest to breast milk, it's the identical structure of breast milk, we can't help but think that this is a ply to simply reach out to those who may be uneducated or ill-informed. This type of formula will be a suitable option for their children, when in fact it was causing more harm than actual good. One of the most dangerous side effects that occurred because of utilizing this formula was when they were mixing it with contaminated water, which then would cause diarrhea, which could lead to the passing of diseases and hurt these children and babies in these third world countries. In addition, what degree of compassion is shown by a company who's looking to profit off the weak and the uneducated of the world? On the outside, it might look like they're trying to do good and to help and to sustain and support these people in these countries, but it just turns out that they're making billions of dollars in this type of market, and it seems that their focus is more so on their business and their success and their well-being. Also evidenced is their anti-utilitarian practices. The International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk is published on a yearly basis, and this is provided by the World Health Organization, strives to help educate and inform people in these developing companies about the benefits of breastfeeding, that it is truly the best for their babies and for their lives, to help them give them the antibodies, the food, the nutrition critical for growth. As a result of our series of boycotts against Nestle and their production, as they sought to deceive and not necessarily provide all the truth with the good and the resources that they had available to them, they could have promoted truth and education and help to these developing countries when in fact they went against that. So we ask, is that right? Is that just? Is that fair? Is it fair to those parents who don't understand? Is it fair to those children who don't have a choice? Is it fair for them to have less than adequate resources provided to them? From that, we believe and say firmly that we don't believe that that is the case.
So in conclusion, we stated the moral problem as, is it right for Nestle to market and give baby formula samples to mothers and promote formula over breast milk? We believe that for all of the reasons aforementioned, that Nestle is engaging in highly unethical practices and really is not doing what's in the best interest for the consumer and society in general, and are not doing the correct moral thing in marketing and giving free samples of formula to mothers and babies in developing countries in particular.